playing great basketball up until this point, and things happen. So there's no disconnect. It's just we just got to go out and figure out how to get a win. And I think once we do that, all this disconnect stuff will go out the window. I feel very good about tonight. Just don't let us get one. But the buzzer sounded. The light was on. It'll be reviewed.
Oh, they're saying on the floor, they're counting it.
You have to protect the offensive rebounding.
Oh, he got rid of it. That's a Celtic win, and we're going to Game 7.
No matter who you're a fan of, we all have to agree on one thing. This was, without a doubt, one of the greatest series that we have ever seen in NBA history. I mean, when the Celtics went down 3-0, we all wrote them off and thought that this series was over. The conclusion of this series was something that you would see in a movie. And to be honest, the script writers were cooking for this series, and I think we all agree. Before we get to the content, we are less than 1,000 subscribers that have my notifications on away from hitting 100K subs that have my notifications on. When we do that, we're going to be announcing 5 giveaway winners for $1,000 split between them. And now that we get all that out of the way, cue the intro. The last pick I gave you guys on my Instagram story hit, and now we have a free square for game 1 of the NBA Finals. Jokic just needs a point. He's gonna get a point. At the time I'm recording this, it's way too early for me to give you your picks, so I'm gonna post my picks onto my story. And if you aren't playing Prize Picks, use my promo code microphone and they'll give you up to $100 free when you deposit $100. Mic check 1 2 1 2. What's going on, everybody? Do you remember when the Boston Celtics went down 3-0 and Marcus Smart had this to say in one of his following media sessions?
There's no disconnect. It's just we're off right now. You know, we had a bad week. We've been playing great basketball up until this point, and things happen. So there's no disconnect. It's just we just got to go out and figure out how to get a win. And I think once we do that, all this disconnect stuff will go out the window.
You feel good about tonight?
I feel very good about tonight. Don't let us get one.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, just don't let us get one. So don't let us get
Kevin
this
Millar?
There you go.
I'm going to be honest, at the time I didn't get the reference and I thought it was the sorriest trash talk that I've ever seen in my life until I realized it was a reference to the 2004 Boston Red Sox. But if the Boston Celtics are able to achieve what Marcus Smart wants to achieve, then they'll definitely be enshrined in history of one of the greatest comebacks, not only in Boston sports, but in all of sports. In all of sports, there are only 4 teams that have come back down from 3-0 in a best-of-7 series. The 2004 Boston Red Sox in the ALCS versus the New York Yankees, the 1942 Toronto Maple Leafs against the Detroit Red Wings in the Stanley Cup Final, the 1975 New York Islanders in the second round against the Pittsburgh Penguins, and probably the most recent was the 2010 Philadelphia Flyers versus the Boston Bruins. So there's not been a single instance in basketball where we've seen a team come back down from 3-0 in order to win the entire series. And given the history between the Boston Celtics and the Miami Heat, that just makes this even more spectacular, because last year the Miami Heat season ended at the hands of the Boston Celtics in a 7-game series. And at the time, Jimmy Butler had this to say.
So we had enough. Next year, we will have enough, and we're going to be right back in the same situation, and we're going to get it done.
Even furthermore, Jimmy Butler has had horrific luck whenever he met with a team in the playoffs that was facing elimination. There were 6 game-winning buzzer beaters in NBA history when facing elimination in NBA history. Jimmy Butler was on the losing end of 3 of them. The first one was when he faced off against the Milwaukee Bucks earlier on in his career with the Chicago Bulls.
Middleton guarded by Butler down there. Dudley up top. Oh, Bennett's got a clean catch. Milwaukee wins it!
The second one is an absolute heartbreaker. I mean, this is one of the worst pains that Philadelphia 76ers fans have ever felt. And that's when,
with the first pick, the Philadelphia 76ers select
The Philadelphia 76ers season ended at the hands of Kawhi Leonard and the Toronto Raptors. That one stung in particular because, well, that was the most competitive team that the Philadelphia 76ers had in recent memory. And honestly, I felt like this was a team that could have made it to the NBA Finals. And then, of course, most recently was Derek White's tip-in of Marcus Smart. Now, following that Game 6 loss, Eric Spoelstra didn't necessarily have words that would give you a lot of confidence in the Miami Heat for their next game. I mean, whenever you lose a game like that and you're on the cusp of being on the opposing end of history and your coach says this
is the way this season's been. This is a one hell of a series. At this time right now, I don't know how we're going to get this done, but we're going to go up there and get it done. And that's what the next 48 hours is about. There's been nothing easy about this season for our group, and so we just have to do it the hard way. And that's just the way it's got to be. We wish we could tip this thing off right now. Right now, we want to tip this thing off, and let's play another 48 minutes, but we'll wait 48 hours and do this thing in Boston.
It's like, I don't know how we're going to do it, but we're going to do it. Believe me. Jimmy Butler was fantastic speaking to the media. I mean, he held himself accountable despite having a remarkable final half of the fourth quarter.
As good or as bad as we played tonight, we still lost, so we still got a job to do at the end of the day. And we will be in this thing together, home, away, on the road. Like I told the guys on the bench, I told the guys in the locker room, if I play better, we're not even in this position, honestly speaking. And I will be better, and that's what makes me smile, because those guys follow my lead. When I'm playing better, I think we're playing better as a whole.
And he even said that the situation that the Miami Heat are in currently is very similar to a final exam. This is how their season ended last year, where Jimmy Butler said this.
So we had enough. Next year, we will have enough, and we're going to be right back in the same situation, and we're going to get it done.
And now they have an opportunity to rectify it this year and get redemption.
Basketball for you. Basketball at its finest. Very, very, very entertaining. But that's good basketball. I believe, as we all do, like, you're going to get the same test until you pass it. I swear. We're in the same position last year. We can do it. I know that we will do it. We got to go on the road and win in a very, very, very tough environment, but we're capable of it, so let's get busy.
Now, there's a lot of controversy surrounding the final shot last game. I mean, primarily the fact that originally there was 2.1 seconds on the clock and they bumped it up to 3 seconds, which made all the difference for Derek White's tip-in. But even furthermore, man, I think we need to show some respect for Derek White, because going into this game, Derek White has played suffocating defense on some remarkable players in this playoff series. I mean, he held Trae Young to 16 of 47 from the field, forced 7 turnovers, and had 5 blocks when the Hawks faced off against the Celtics. Then in the next round, Tyrese Maxey was 12 of 32 from the field, 2 turnovers, and Derek White had 1 block on him. And then going into Game 7, prior to Game 7, Jimmy Butler was 12 of 31 from the field with 1 turnover forced and 4 blocks, and Derek White having 4 blocks against him in this series. So I don't want to sit here and say there's like luck here and there, because there's a lot of variables that get both of the teams into the situations that they were in currently, and as a result we got a remarkable series. Going into Game 7, there was a fantastic narrative surrounding who was refereeing this game. I don't know who said it, but someone stated that since Scott Foster was refereeing this game, then the Miami Heat were at a huge disadvantage. This was one of the graphics I saw. Celtics 12-0 in games officiated by Scott Foster, which I feel like that's just such a narrow view of everything. It's like people are automatically accepting this as fact. But when you look at Scott Foster's history of refereeing the Boston Celtics and the Miami Heat have the most wins out of every team when Scott Foster is refereeing them, and the stats show that. So I kind of threw that narrative in the trash, although people really liked running away with it. Now, it also stated that the Heat were a combined 0 of 10 in games reffed by both Tony Brothers and Scott Foster during the regular season. The Celtics were 7-2. Brothers and Foster are both in the referee crew for Game 7. But despite all this, you still saw Jimmy Butler and the Miami Heat do something very atypical, and that's the fact that they actually purchased a flight to Denver even before the game started. I mean, if that's what gets you going, man, then by all means go for it. But now that you guys understand all of the narratives to this game, let's talk about the game itself. The Boston Celtics had a very horrific first quarter, which is surprising considering the fact that they were at home. They finished the first quarter with 15 points, shooting 26% of the field, shot 10 threes and didn't make a single one of them. Jason Tatum only shot the ball one time, and they turned over the ball on 4 different occasions. The worst part of all is that the Boston Celtics' best player, Jason Tatum, would injure his ankle severely, and that would alter the trajectory of the game. The Miami Heat didn't necessarily make the most out of this because they didn't necessarily have the greatest first quarter, but it was enough to get off to a 7-point lead against the Boston Celtics. Miami Heat would also outscore the Boston Celtics in the second quarter as well to pull ahead 52-41 at halftime. At halftime, the top narrative that we had was the fact that the Boston Celtics were struggling from 3, 4 of 21 from 3, and this is after going 7 of 35 in game 6, which is kind of surprising because you wouldn't think that the game plan would be to shoot as many threes as you possibly can when you struggle to shoot the 3 in your previous game. Whereas the Miami Heat were scorching hot. 50% of their threes went in, 8 of 16, with Caleb Martin and Jimmy Butler leading the way in the first half, and almost every single member of the Miami Heat starting 5 being on the positive end on plus minus. The Boston Celtics would come out fighting in the third quarter. I mean, Derek White really turned it up and tried to be one of the main role players for the Celtics in the third quarter, and he had a remarkable game at that, I must admit. But to be honest, the fact that Jason Tatum was limited this much, and despite him playing 40 plus minutes for the game, clearly his injury influenced the game significantly, and as a result, the Boston Celtics would end up losing the game, which is kind of a shame because I would have loved to see what could have been had Jason Tatum been at full strength. This is a guy that's given us really magnificent Game 7 performances and late game heroics. He couldn't overcome the injury to do that this game, and that's the end of the Celtics season. And now we need to discuss the ramifications of that because the Celtics have been through a lot this season. I have to admit, a part of me thinks it's pretty comical that we're about to see a 1 seed versus an 8 seed in the NBA Finals, only it's the 1 seed on the West and the 8 seed on the East. Regardless, I have to admit that this year's NBA playoffs was anything but predictable. I mean, the way the Boston Celtics got to the Eastern Conference Finals in of itself was very impressive, coming back down from a 3-2 deficit against their former head coach, although it was from like over a decade ago, Doc Rivers. But unfortunately, their season ended at the hands of Jimmy Butler. And if there's one thing I really appreciate about this year's NBA playoff, the fact that we're truly beginning to get a glimpse at some of the stars that the NBA has to offer that have been ignored for the most part. For the past decade, we've been hearing primarily about Steph Curry and LeBron James. And although that sounds like a casual basketball fan's wet dream, it's really nice to see Jimmy Butler get another crack at trying to potentially add a ring to his collection in the manner that he's doing it. By the way, an 8th seed is insane, and it's nice to see Nikola Jokic also getting that same opportunity. With that being said, this video isn't about the Denver Nuggets and the Miami Heat. This video is about the future of the Boston Celtics that looks very, very gloomy to say the least. And to really understand how gloomy it is, we have to go all the way back to where the Celtics were 2 years ago. You see, 2 years ago, we were having the exact same conversation about the Boston Celtics, only in a different lens. See, the Boston Celtics finished in 7th place in the Eastern Conference. They lost via a gentleman's sweep in the first round versus the Brooklyn Nets, which is kind of some interesting foreshadowing because the very next year, the exact opposite would happen. But at the time, there were questions about the future of this team. Should they break up Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum? Should they just completely punt on this core? The team was constructed well, but there was one very big problem. And that's the fact that nobody in the entire NBA trusted their general manager, Danny Ainge. He had this reputation of trying to screw people in trades, and it seemed like the Boston Celtics needed a huge shakeup. So they did something that, I'm going to be honest, I didn't think would work, but it did. Their head coach, Brad Stevens, stepped down as the head coach of the Boston Celtics and instead made the transition to a role in the front office. He pretty much took Danny Ainge's job, and instead they decided to hire Ime Udoka as their new head coach. But that's not the only decisions that they would make to try to save the Boston Celtics. That offseason, they decided to punt on the Kemba Walker experiment and traded him alongside the 16th overall pick in the 2021 NBA draft to the OKC Thunder to bring back a familiar face that they didn't want to pay a couple years ago, Al Horford, Moses Brown, and a 2023 second round pick. This was a beautiful trade for both sides. Al Horford was having a lot of trouble figuring out an identity for himself once he left Boston. Let's not even talk about his 76ers tenure that I'm sure we all deleted from our brains headlines because at this point, the Boston Celtics made a very sneaky move that wasn't going to get blown up in the media. It's not like you added a superstar, but this is a move that without a doubt had a huge impact on the Celtics. I mean, bringing in a player that truly understood what those Boston Celtic conference championship teams were made out of, it was a huge focal point of it, offensively and defensively. The impact could not be overstated. And to be honest, that was more or less all they really needed. Adding Ime Udoka and Al Horford in the offseason isn't necessarily the sexiest decision to make, but it was more than enough because the Boston Celtics weren't necessarily an incredible team in the first half of the 2021 to 2022 season, but man, in the second half of that season, they were the top defensive team in the league. I mean, overall, if you looked at their defensive rating for the year, they were second, but they really hit their stride in the second half of the season once the All-Star break was over. They would get their revenge on the Brooklyn Nets in the first round, sweeping them 4-0. They would then defeat the defending champion Milwaukee Bucks in a 7-game series before defeating the Miami Heat in a 7-game series to face off against the Golden State Warriors in the NBA Finals, which, by the way, they were heavily favored in. But unfortunately, against the Golden State Warriors, the Boston Celtics would come up short. You could blame it on inexperience. You could blame it on a rookie head coach getting outcoached by Steve Kerr. You could blame it on a myriad of reasons, but at the end of the day, I think it was a combination of the Warriors' experience, a bunch of hungry young players in Andrew Wiggins and Jordan Poole. They were both on contract years at the time, and the fact that Steve Kerr had significantly more experience coaching the Golden State Warriors than Ime Udoka had on the Boston Celtics. The good news was the future was very, very bright for this Boston Celtics team. I mean, Jaylen Brown was 25 years old at the time. Jason Tatum was only 24 years old at the time. They clearly hit on their head coach in Ime Udoka, and following an offseason that followed the same exact theme, let's not go for the splashy big name free agent. Instead, let's add additional role players and pieces around Jason Tatum, Marcus Smart, and Jaylen Brown that would fit into Ime Udoka's offense, and let's just destroy these teams with our depth. And ultimately, that's what they aimed to do in the offseason. Trading for Malcolm Brogdon, which I said was one of the sneakiest additions in the entire offseason, which paid off remarkably for them. In addition to that, bringing in Danilo Gallinari, which didn't make that much of a difference because, well, Danilo Gallinari suffered a huge injury. Things were looking really promising for the Boston Celtics until right around the beginning of the season. You see, Ime Udoka, that head coach that they nailed, I mean, just knocked that hiring out of the park, was under an alleged scandal involving infidelity towards the woman that he was with, Nia Long, and potentially an alleged inappropriate relationship with a woman that works for the Boston Celtics. Now, I don't know how word got out about this because I remember at the time Adrian Wojnarowski tweeted out about it, and he was very vague about what's going on. He just said that the Boston Celtics may need to suspend Ime Udoka for a period of time, but he didn't even know what was going on. That's how good of a secret this was kept. Then eventually word came out about what's actually going on. Now, I don't know if this came from the Celtics side. I don't know if this came from an insider. I don't know if this came from one of the sources within, but regardless, the news came out and the situation was so bad that the Boston Celtics had to suspend Ime Udoka. Now, if this happened in July, yeah, it would be a huge sting. It would not necessarily be as difficult as it would have been given when Ime Udoka was dismissed, which was within a few weeks of the regular season starting. And according to Adrian Wojnarowski, his team never got over Ime Udoka getting dismissed.
In this locker room, they never got over Ime Udoka's dismissal as head coach. These players did not accept the organization's reasoning for doing it. Wild overreaction. There were a lot of people on the outside who thought it was an overreaction. It was an HR matter. I think for this team and talking with management, they never got the answers. They got any more answers than the public was getting. Doesn't mean they haven't accepted Joe Mazzulla as head coach. This is a team that really believed in Ime Udoka, had a strong connection with him.
If you don't believe that, well, pay attention to what Jason Tatum said about Ime Udoka.
Because without, whatever happened, and that's, doesn't have anything to do with me, but, I can't take away the relationship that me and him had and the impact that he had on me in that one season. Different kind of relationship I had with Ime, and, probably like my most favorite coach I've had, and that's not to a knock on anybody.
Woj continued to say, I think there were a couple of instances this season where a lot of that angst resurfaced. First when the Brooklyn Nets nearly hired Udoka as head coach, and then when the Rockets did. Certainly those were factors. Woj would also say that the Celtics made a mistake and potentially not hiring a more experienced coach than Joe Mazzulla. Joe Mazzulla is 2 years younger than Al Horford, to give you an idea. And to be honest, if there's one thing that was evident in this Eastern Conference Finals, it's the fact that Eric Spoelstra was just running laps around Joe Mazzulla in regards to coaching. Now, were the Boston Celtics too trigger happy on firing Ime Udoka? I think the way they went about it should have been a little different. I feel like originally their plan was to just suspend him and then have HR handle it, and then as time went on, they just decided to completely move away from him. Maybe because Joe Mazzulla was having success in the regular season, but we've talked about it many times on this channel before. Success in the regular season as a head coach doesn't necessarily translate to success in the postseason as a head coach, because in the postseason, when you're going up against teams in a best-of-4 series, a lot of it comes down to a chess match between the coaches. A lot of it comes to lineup adjustments and noticing patterns and trends in what the teams are doing. And in this case, there's no question about it. Joe Mazzulla is simply outmatched against Eric Spoelstra. It's not his fault. It's that you're going up against a head coach that has won multiple championships and has made it to the NBA Finals many times with different cores, by the way. This is a coach that was in the NBA Finals 3 years ago. So do I think that the Boston Celtics overreacted in firing Ime Udoka? Well, it's really difficult to say, because I'm sure that was their last resort. I'm sure they looked at what the situation actually was, which they've hidden that from us, by the way. All we have is Matt Barnes saying that what it is really, really bad.
Without knowing all the facts, I spoke on Ime Udoka's defense, and after finding out the facts after I spoke, I erased what I posted, because this situation in Boston is deep, it's messy, it's 100 times uglier than any of us thought.
And that's all we know. So they clearly know more than us, and clearly this wasn't their top choice. If a coach gets you all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals, ideally you bring him back. It was just an unfortunate circumstance, and not only did the Boston Celtics have a problem trying to keep Udoka, but the Brooklyn Nets had an issue trying to hire Udoka, and Udoka had a rapport with the players there. But I can understand if the Boston Celtics players felt a specific way about this happening. The reason I'm bringing this up is there's some changes coming to the Celtics. One being that the Celtics would consider firing Joe Mazzulla. Now, last week in the draft combine, sources told Jake Fisher of Yahoo that the Celtics would give Mazzulla quite a bit of runway to grow into an elevated role on the team's sideline, because Mazzulla is 34 years old, which is 2 years younger than Brad Stevens was when he was hired by the Celtics as a head coach, and the Celtics initially elevated Mazzulla to interim head coach following the suspension of Ime Udoka, and then signed him to an extension, giving him the head coaching job permanently in February. If the Celtics suddenly reversed course on Mazzulla, it would be a stark change of direction from the franchise's original intent to allow Mazzulla similar time to flourish in the position. Now, if you ask me, personally, I feel like at this point you've invested so much in Mazzulla that you might as well try to give it another go. But the bigger issue isn't necessarily Joe Mazzulla. The bigger issue is, what do they do with their two superstars, Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum? Both Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum made it to the All-NBA team this year. Jaylen Brown being named to the All-NBA second team, whereas teammate Jason Tatum was named to the All-NBA first team on Wednesday. This makes them both eligible for Supermax extensions, and Brown is entering the final year of his contract and is eligible to sign said extension this summer, while Tatum is eligible next summer. This is significant. They're the first two Celtics teammates to do this since Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett in the 2008 championship season, that they will consistently remind you about over and over again. Now, the Celtics can offer Jaylen Brown about $295 million over 5 years, which would make Jaylen Brown the highest paid player in NBA history. Jokic signed a 5-year, $270 million Supermax last summer, and then Jason Tatum can beat that contract next summer, which will kick in for the 2025 to 2026 season. Now, you might be wondering, Mike, what's the problem with this? Well, in the past, if you have two superstars on your team and they both deserve Supermax contract extensions, it's a no-brainer. You do it. Now it seems like the CBA is treating these situations almost as if if you're constructing a super team. In the past, you would automatically extend these players. Now, in the past, there's always been an apron, which means if you go $6 million above the luxury tax, you get a hard cap in certain situations, which will inhibit a team from making a sign and trade or use the biannual exception. There's now a double apron, which means you still have the $6 million above the luxury tax, but there's a $17.5 million apron above the luxury tax line that creates even more restrictions. This is as a result of the Golden State Warriors, by the way. The NBA doesn't want more teams like the Warriors. When you hit $17.5 million, the first thing that you lose is the taxpayer mid-level exception, meaning you can't bring in a player like Dante DiVincenzo on the Golden State Warriors. You can't send out cash in trades to buy second-round picks or deep bench players, and you can't trade first-round picks 7 years out, which is the way the Boston Celtics got Derek White. Now, the significance of this is it makes it even harder for the Celtics to add additional players to the roster. The only young player that they have on this roster at this point, at least in my opinion, is Robert Williams III, who is still in the rotation. They may lose Grant Williams if he can find a good free agency market, which I think he will. Peyton Pritchard already made it clear that he wants to leave, and the Celtics aren't really developing any players currently, and there's nobody who could currently replace a player like Marcus Smart, Malcolm Brogdon, or Derek White. So the problem is, if you give Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum these supermax contracts, there's going to be so many restrictions upon you that there's no way you could compete in the future. That's before we get to some of the stuff that Jaylen Brown has been saying this past year. You've heard him call out the city of Boston for some of the things that they say, and then there was this interview following the Game 4 loss in Philadelphia.
I guess I got to demand the ball a little bit more. I thought good things happened when I had it in my hands.
There's also a question about whether or not Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum are a good fit together, which means the Celtics are in a situation where they got to consider potentially trading Jaylen Brown, or they're going to just continue to build around this core of Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, but they're going to have a significantly worse team moving forward. Of course, there's the possibility that Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum could take pay cuts, but would they really do that? This is the biggest contract of their career, possibly. So what I think could potentially happen is the Celtics might have to trade Jaylen Brown. A team that I floated up in the past was the Houston Rockets because, one, their head coach currently is Ime Udoka. Two, they have a plethora of young athletes that they can develop and a lot of assets moving forward in the future. They also have the number 4 pick in this year's NBA draft. So you could trade a player like Jaylen Brown and get back a trade package surrounding Jalen Green and maybe a couple of first-round picks for the future. And that not only gets you out of your salary cap hell situation, but it also gives you a young player to develop while Jason Tatum hits his prime. It makes it clear that Jason Tatum is the face of your franchise, and it also replenishes your pool of assets. There's a lot of directions that the Boston Celtics could go in. And the thing is, there's not a single path that sounds comfortable at this point. Throughout the 2010s, following the Big Three era, the Boston Celtics have consistently been the team that almost made it to the promised land, almost hoisted up the Larry O'Brien trophy, but they would always come a few inches too short. And the way they decide to handle this offseason could be the difference between them hoisting a Larry O'Brien trophy or not even getting close for the duration of Jason Tatum's career. So what would you do if you're the Boston Celtics? Let me know in the comment section down below. Aside from that, I'm your boy Mike, and I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.